My name is Maya, and I'm 28 years old. 10 years ago, at my high school graduation dinner, my parents handed my older brother a check for $20,000 to fund his third failed app startup. Then my mother slid a community college brochure across the table to me. In front of 15 relatives, they proudly announced they had emptied my $85,000 college fund to support my brother's real potential. They left me to pay for my own education while my extended family watched in silence. What they did not know was that a wealthy former employer had already secured a full-ride private scholarship in my name. By trying to financially cripple my future to elevate their golden child, they handed me the exact independence I needed to cut them off forever. Before I tell you exactly how I became a millionaire while they went bankrupt, welcome to Sweet Karma Life. Please take a moment to like and subscribe if you have ever watched your parents drain your resources to fund a lazy sibling. And drop your age, location, and local time in the comments. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to that dinner at a garlic-scented Italian restaurant and the manila envelope that ended my family. The tension did not begin with shouting. It started with the clinking of a butter knife against a water goblet. My parents had booked the back room of a local restaurant to celebrate my high school graduation. I wore a modest navy dress, sitting quietly near the corner, tracing the condensation on my glass. At the head of the table sat my father, Richard. He cleared his throat and adjusted his tie. Beside him, my mother, Susan, offered the room a rehearsed, melancholic smile. "If everyone could gather their attention," my father announced. His voice carried the practiced rhythm of a manager addressing a reluctant staff. The chatter died down. Forks rested against porcelain plates. "Tonight we celebrate milestones," he continued. "But as a family, we also must make difficult choices to foster true vision." He did not look at me. He looked across the table at my older brother, Chase. Chase was 22. He was currently on his third attempt at launching a tech company, having dropped out of university 3 semesters prior. He slouched in his chair, wearing a designer blazer over a wrinkled shirt, endlessly scrolling on his phone. My father reached into his breast pocket and produced a manila envelope. He slid it across the tablecloth. It stopped directly in front of my brother. "Chase," my father said, pride swelling in his chest. "Your mother and I believe in your ideas. We know this next venture is the one. Here is $20,000 for the seed capital." A ripple of polite, confused applause circled the room. Uncle David stopped chewing. The math did not align for anyone present. We were a middle-class household. $20,000 was not spare change. Then came the pivot. My mother turned to me. She slid a heavy piece of cardstock across the table. It was not a greeting card. It was a tri-fold brochure for the local community college. "Maya," my mother said, her tone dripping with manufactured sorrow. "We are so proud of your grades, but your brother's startup requires immediate backing. We had to liquidate your savings account." She meant the $85,000 college fund my late grandfather had seeded. Because the account was structured under a custodial loophole, my parents had a legal window to move the funds before my 19th birthday. They did not just spend my future, they performed a legal heist on their own daughter. I knew that fighting them in court would take years and tie me to their toxicity forever. In that moment, I chose to trade that $85,000 for a clean break and total silence. The silence in the room became a physical weight. My cousin stared hard at the tablecloth. The audience waited for the explosion. They expected the teenager to cry, to beg, to flip the table. They anticipated a hysterical reaction which would neatly validate my mother's long-standing narrative. The narrative that Maya was unstable, while Chase was the grounded visionary. I looked down at the paper. The brochure advertised an associate degree in general studies. I did not blink. I picked up the pamphlet, folded it neatly along its existing creases, and tucked it inside my purse. I looked up and offered my mother a polite, serene smile. "Thank you," I said softly. My mother blinked, visibly thrown by the lack of resistance. Chase scoffed and pocketed his check without a single word of gratitude. What neither of them knew, what no one in that room understood, was that their betrayal had arrived 3 months too late. They thought they were clipping my wings to build Chase a runway. In reality, they had just severed the last string attaching me to their sinking ship. To understand my silence at that table, you have to understand the secret I had been keeping for my entire senior year. The ride home from the restaurant was thick with a triumphant kind of silence. My parents sat in the front seats of their mid-sized sedan, projecting the quiet satisfaction of a successful military campaign. They thought they had secured their golden child's future while simultaneously putting me in my proper place. My mother adjusted the radio volume, humming along to a soft rock station. She assumed my quietness in the back seat was the paralysis of a defeated teenager. She believed she had boxed me into a corner where my only option was to rely on them, thereby remaining under their control. I stared out the window at the passing streetlights. I was not defeated. I was doing mental math. To grasp the sheer scale of their miscalculation, we have to rewind slightly. While my parents were busy cultivating Chase's imaginary genius, I spent my junior and senior years of high school living a parallel existence under the same roof. The disparity in our household was not subtle. It was measurable in dollars and cents. My grandfather had established trust accounts for both Chase and me before he passed away. Each account held $40,000 initially. Over the years, with basic interest, mine had grown to $85,000. Chase drained his account the moment he turned 18. He spent it on a down payment for a luxury truck, a fraternity initiation fee, and a European backpacking trip that lasted exactly 3 weeks before he ran out of cash. Because I was still a minor, my parents retained legal custodianship of my fund. I operated under the naive assumption that the money would sit safely until I enrolled in a university. During my junior year, Chase totaled his luxury truck. He had been texting while driving and rear-ended a commercial delivery van. The insurance deductible was $2,500. My father wrote the check the very next morning from his personal account, calling it an unfortunate learning experience. 2 weeks later, my mother bought Chase a designer winter coat because he complained about waiting for the bus while his vehicle was in the repair shop. During that exact same time period, I was working 25 hours a week. I did not ask for a vehicle. I walked 2 miles to the public library after school, then took the city transit bus to an affluent neighborhood across town. I worked as a personal assistant to Evelyn Gallagher. Mrs. Gallagher was not a warm, cookie-baking grandmother figure. She was a 72-year-old self-made commercial real estate investor. She wore tailored wool suits, carried a silver-tip cane, and possessed a gaze that felt like a forensic audit. She hired me to file paperwork, balance her personal ledgers, and organize decades of property deeds. My parents barely acknowledged my job. To them, it was just a way for me to pay for my own school supplies so they could reallocate their income toward Chase's endless needs. They never asked what I did. If they had, they would have realized I was receiving a masterclass in wealth management before I even had a high school diploma. Mrs. Gallagher did not just look at my work. She looked at my life. One afternoon, she intentionally dropped a heavy silver coin on the floor and watched me scramble to pick it up. She saw the worn-out soles of my thrifted loafers and the way I skipped lunch to study estate tax law. She never offered me a sandwich or a pitying look. Instead, she handed me a more complex ledger to audit, forcing me to earn the knowledge that would later make me rich. She taught me that sympathy is a cheap currency, but leverage is everything. Maya, your brother needs $80 to cover a parking ticket. Transfer it to his account right now or he cannot get to his internship interview. Maya, we need you to buy your own winter boots this year. The household budget is a bit tight. I would hang up the phone, log into my banking application, and watch my minimum wage earnings vanish to subsidize a young man who slept until noon. I never complained. I just worked harder. I read SAT prep books during my 15-minute lunch breaks. I studied tax law terminology while cross-referencing Mrs. Gallagher's estate documents. One Tuesday afternoon, about 2 months before that fateful graduation dinner, Mrs. Gallagher called me into her study. The room smelled of polished mahogany and expensive black tea. She sat behind her massive desk and gestured for me to sit opposite her. She slid a thick, cream-colored envelope across the leather blotter. "Open it," she instructed. I broke the seal. Inside was official letterhead from one of the most elite private universities in the country. It was an acceptance letter, but it was not just an admission offer. Pinned to the back was a financial aid breakdown detailing a premier alumni scholarship. It covered tuition, housing, textbooks, and a modest living stipend for 4 consecutive years. The bottom line stated a total value of $240,000. I stared at the numbers until the black ink began to blur into the cream-colored paper. For the first time in years, the icy professional mask I had built to survive my parents began to crack. My throat tightened, and a single hot tear escaped, landing on the corner of the scholarship offer. I was not just looking at money. I was looking at my exit ramp. I was looking at the first person in my life who saw me as an asset to be cultivated rather than a well to be drained. "I made 3 phone calls," Mrs. Gallagher said. Her voice was dry and unsentimental. "I sit on the alumni board. I sent them your transcripts, your test scores, and a personal character reference. You are an asset, Maya, and I do not allow valuable assets to be squandered by foolish people." I tried to find the words to thank her, but she held up a single manicured hand to stop me. "There is one condition," she continued, leaning forward. Her eyes were sharp, pinning me to the chair. "You will not tell your parents. You will not tell your brother. You will not breathe a word of this to anyone in your family until you have physically moved your belongings out of their house." I asked her why. I thought the news of a full ride might finally earn me the pride my father reserved exclusively for Chase. Mrs. Gallagher tapped her cane against the floorboard. "If you tell them you have a free ride, they will rationalize taking whatever savings you have left. They will view your success as a surplus they can drain to pave his driveway. Your silence is your armor. Do you understand?" I understood perfectly. I signed the acceptance forms that afternoon. So, when we returned to the Italian restaurant, to the manila envelope and the community college brochure, you can see why I did not shatter. My mother thought she was punishing me by draining my $85,000 fund. She thought she was sentencing me to a life of mediocrity. She did not know I was sitting there holding a golden ticket. She did not know that by zeroing out my account to hand Chase $20,000, she was legally and morally severing all my obligations to them. They had justified the theft by claiming they were investing in the child with the most potential. The math was simple. I lost $85,000, but I gained $250,000 and my permanent freedom from their financial ecosystem. The graduation dinner ended. We drove home in that quiet sedan. I went up to my bedroom and placed the community college brochure on my nightstand. I used it as a coaster for my water glass. Then I pulled a single duffel bag from my closet and began to pack my clothes. I did not need to plan a dramatic exit or write a bitter farewell letter. I just needed to wait for the sun to rise. The real test was not leaving the house. The real test was what would happen when Chase burned through that $20,000 and my parents realized their obedient scapegoat was no longer around to absorb the deficit. The financial drain was about to begin, and they had no idea I was watching the clock tick down. The morning I moved out was remarkably quiet. There were no tearful embraces at the front door, no unsolicited parental advice about navigating the adult world. The house operated with the cold efficiency of a business pivoting toward its most valuable asset. My father was stationed at the kitchen island, a telephone pressed to his ear, loudly negotiating a commercial lease for a company that possessed zero revenue. Chase sat across from him, sketching an uninspired logo on a napkin, sipping a protein shake. My mother was occupied at the desktop computer in the den. She was busy researching a Caribbean cruise to celebrate her newly emptied nest. I carried my 2 duffel bags down the hallway. The floorboards creaked. No one looked up. I paused at the threshold of the living room. "I am heading to the bus station," I announced. My mother did not turn away from her glowing screen. "Have a safe trip," she called out, her tone absent and flat. "Remember to budget your grocery money carefully." My father offered a vague nod without breaking his conversation with the real estate broker. I walked out, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind me. The lock clicked, severing 18 years of history. I had fed them a highly believable fiction. I claimed I had found a shared apartment in a gritty, industrial part of the city. I told them I would be splitting rent with 3 strangers and taking night classes at a vocational school to make ends meet. It fit their worldview perfectly. The scapegoat, struggling to survive, rightfully punished for lacking her brother's visionary spark. I walked 2 miles to the Greyhound station, carrying everything I owned. I boarded a bus smelling of stale coffee and diesel fuel, but I did not step off into a cramped walk-up. I arrived at the manicured, gated quadrangle of a premier business school. My keycard granted me access to a private suite with mahogany desks, high-speed internet, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the historic campus. While my parents pictured me scrubbing grease off a diner counter, I was sitting in macroeconomics seminars taught by former hedge fund managers. Mrs. Gallagher had orchestrated everything flawlessly. The scholarship covered my housing, my textbooks, and a modest monthly stipend deposited directly into an independent checking account. For the first time in my life, I was untethered, focused, and mathematically secure. The next 2 years established a devastating asymmetry. While I was sitting in a windowless library basement at 2 a.m, memorizing corporate tax codes and eating generic brand oatmeal, the family group chat was a gallery of Chase's delusions. He posted photos of a custom $1,200 neon sign for an office that had no clients. I responded by quietly moving another $500 of my internship stipend into an index fund. He uploaded videos of catered sushi lunches for unpaid interns. I celebrated my high marks on a macroeconomics final by treating myself to a single luxury: a brand new pair of professional shoes that did not have holes in the soles. We were both building empires, but mine was made of stone, while his was made of digital smoke. The shift in the group chat was subtle at first. The photos of catered lunches stopped. The updates about disruptive technology were replaced by vague complaints about a shifting market and unreliable vendors. Then, the silence stretched. Weeks passed without a single picture of the neon sign. When the well ran dry, the ecosystem required a new source of water. The subtle demands began on a Thursday evening during my sophomore year. I was sitting in the university library analyzing corporate tax structures when my phone vibrated. It was a direct message from my mother. She did not ask how my night classes were going. She sent a link to an article titled "The Importance of Family Loyalty in Modern Times." 2 hours later, the actual request arrived. "Maya, your brother is experiencing a minor cash flow issue with his suppliers," she wrote. "We are helping him restructure his business model, but he needs a temporary $500 loan to cover his personal rent this month. You have always been so resourceful. Please transfer it to his account by Friday morning." The audacity was a marvel of human psychology. They drained my $85,000 fund to zero, handed it to him, and were now asking the supposedly destitute daughter to bail him out of his own financial mismanagement. They expected the lifelong conditioning to kick in. They assumed I would empty whatever meager savings I had scraped together to protect the family image. I did not write a long paragraph defending myself. I did not point out the glaring hypocrisy. I opened my laptop, pulled up a generic job hunting website, and took 3 screenshots of applications for overnight warehouse shifts paying minimum wage. I sent the images to my mother. My reply was 3 sentences. "I cannot make rent this month either. If Chase finds any job openings, let me know. My bank account is overdrawn." The response from my mother was immediate silence. She did not offer me a loan. She did not ask how I would afford to eat. The moment I proved I was not a viable financial resource, I ceased to exist in her daily concerns. She stopped texting entirely. The $500 was just a test balloon. It was a symptom of a much deeper rot spreading through my parents' bank accounts. Chase was drowning, and instead of letting him learn how to swim, my father and mother were tying their own life vests to his ankles. My strategic poverty bought me time. I spent my sophomore and junior years quietly building a fortified wall around my assets. I monitored the slow, inevitable collapse of my family from a safe distance. But a facade built on delusion can only hold for so long before the structural integrity gives way. The creditors were circling Chase, and the minor cash flow issues were about to mutate into devastating debt. And when the pressure became too great, my parents would stop asking for $500 via text message. They would orchestrate a much larger trap, setting the stage for a smear campaign that would force me to choose between my hard-earned peace and their fabricated reality. The silence from my parents lasted almost an entire year. During that time, the group chat transformed from a highlight reel into a digital graveyard. The updates stopped. The photos of catered lunches were replaced by total silence. The neon sign that cost $1,200 was unceremoniously unplugged, and Chase's startup officially collapsed during the spring semester of my junior year. He left behind a devastating trail of unpaid vendors, maxed-out corporate credit cards, and a broken commercial lease. In a rational family ecosystem, this would be the moment of reckoning. A normal parent would sit their 24-year-old son down, cut off his allowance, and demand he secure an entry-level job to pay off his debts. But my family operated on a different frequency. My parents viewed Chase's failure not as a lack of competence, but as a tragic injustice inflicted upon a misunderstood genius by a cruel world. Instead of holding him accountable, they doubled down. The math of their devotion became terrifying. My father co-signed a personal loan for $45,000 to consolidate my brother's mounting debt, legally binding his own retirement security to a son who had never held a job for more than 6 months. The panic in their household must have been suffocating. They were drowning, tethered to an anchor of their own creation. To offset their terrifying new reality, they set their sights on the one variable they thought they could still control: me. It started on a Tuesday evening. I was sitting in my dorm room reviewing a complex portfolio analysis for my corporate finance class. My phone lit up. It was my mother calling. I had not heard her voice in 11 months. I let it ring 3 times before answering. "Hello," I said, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "Maya, sweetheart," my mother crooned. Her voice dripped with manufactured sweetness, thick and cloying. It was the exact tone she used when organizing church bake sales or manipulating a neighbor into hosting a block party. "It is so good to hear your voice. We miss you so much around the house." I did not take the bait. I waited. "Listen," she continued, shifting gears with practiced ease. "Your brother is going through a temporary rough patch. The market just did not understand his vision. It is a setback, but he is pivoting. He found a fantastic new opportunity across town. The problem is, his car lease expired and his credit is temporarily bruised from the business restructuring. He just needs a reliable vehicle to get to his new interviews." The audacity was almost poetic. She was framing a massive financial failure as a minor bruising. I kept my eyes on my laptop screen. "Okay," replied simply. "We found a sensible sedan for him," she said, her pace quickening. "The dealer just needs a cosigner to get the interest rate down. Your father and I are a bit tied up with restructuring our own assets right now. Since your credit is a blank slate from not having any major loans, it would really help the family if you put your name on the paperwork." "It is just a formality, Maya. Chase will make all the payments." She was asking an allegedly impoverished college student who she believed was sharing a tiny apartment and taking night classes to co-sign a multi-$1,000 auto loan for a sibling who had just torched $45,000. "Mom, I cannot do that," I said, my voice steady. "I work minimum wage. I do not have the income to qualify. And I cannot take on that risk." The sweetness vanished instantly. It was as if I had flipped a switch. Her tone went ice cold. "Risk," she snapped. "He is your brother. We are talking about family loyalty. You have been holding this petty grudge over your savings account for 3 years. We made an investment in this family's future, and you are punishing us because you are jealous of his ambition." I did not raise my voice. I did not engage in the argument. "I have to get back to my shift," I lied smoothly. "I cannot sign the loan. Good night." I hung up the phone. I knew exactly what would happen next. When a toxic system is denied its fuel, it does not self-reflect. It attacks. The smear campaign was mobilized within 48 hours. My mother could not control my actions, but she could absolutely control the narrative. She weaponized the extended family, drafting them into an army of righteous indignation. The first strike came from Aunt Linda. She called me on Thursday morning while I was walking to a seminar. Aunt Linda was the kind of woman who lived for suburban drama, thriving on the misery of others while maintaining a facade of deep concern. "Maya, I am incredibly disappointed in you," she began, not bothering with a greeting. "Your parents are bending over backwards to keep this family afloat, and you refuse to lift a finger to help your own flesh and blood. Your mother is in tears. She told me you are still bitter about that little college fund. It is time to grow up. You work a dead-end retail job, you have no real prospects, and you are acting like you are better than everyone else." I stopped on the sidewalk. The narrative had been completely rewritten. In their version of reality, Chase was a brilliant entrepreneur, tragically misunderstood by the market, and I was a vindictive, selfish failure holding a petty grudge while hoarding whatever meager pennies I earned. A younger, more fragile version of me would have fired back. I would have drafted a furious, multi-paragraph text message outlining every dollar they stole. I would have screamed into the phone that I was actually a top-tier business student living on a massive private scholarship. I would have handed them all my ammunition just to prove I was worthy of their respect. But Mrs. Gallagher's voice echoed in my head. "Silence is your armor." I did not defend myself. I did not correct Aunt Linda. I simply said, "I am sorry you feel that way, Aunt Linda. I have to go to class." I hung up. I let them build their house of cards on a foundation of lies. I let them paint me as the villain in their tragedy. I understood a fundamental truth about wealth and power. You do not win by arguing with people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You win by outperforming them in total silence. While they spent their energy gossiping about my fictional retail job, I was finalizing the paperwork for a highly competitive summer internship. It was at a premier wealth management firm in downtown Chicago. They selected 3 interns out of 2,000 applicants. I was one of them. The compensation was $8,000 a month plus a housing stipend. I spent that entire summer sitting in boardrooms overlooking Lake Michigan, analyzing municipal bonds, and learning how to protect millions of dollars from tax liabilities. I was 21 years old, building an unbreakable financial fortress, while my parents were desperately co-signing loans for a son who was still living in their basement. The contrast was staggering, but the real danger was not the car loan. The car loan was just a symptom of the disease. My parents were bleeding out financially, and they were running out of bandages. The graduation snub was approaching, and the pivot they were about to make would permanently seal their fate. The collision course was set, and they were driving straight into a concrete wall at full speed. My university graduation arrived on a humid morning in late May. The contrast between this milestone and my high school exit 4 years prior was night and day. I was standing in the staging area, wearing a black gown adorned with gold cords. I was graduating summa cum laude. I carried 0 student debt. Folded safely inside my jacket pocket was a signed employment contract from a top-tier wealth management firm. I looked around at the families swarming the campus lawn. Fathers carried floral bouquets. Mothers adjusted their daughters' graduation caps. My phone vibrated in my hand. It was a brief text message from my mother. "Maya, so sorry we cannot make the flight today. The airfare is simply too steep right now. Chase is dealing with some hostile legal threats from an old investor, and your father needs to help him consult with an attorney. Have a lovely ceremony. We will mail a card." They could not afford a $200 domestic flight to watch their daughter receive a prestigious degree, but they could easily afford retainer fees for a corporate defense lawyer to shield their golden child from the consequences of his own fraud. I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel the familiar sting of rejection. I deleted the message and lined up with my cohort. When the dean called my name, I walked across the stage, took my diploma, and smiled for the professional photographer. I did not celebrate alone. That evening, I walked into a mahogany-paneled private dining room at a five-star steakhouse downtown. Sitting at the head of the table, sipping sparkling water and leaning on her silver-tipped cane, was Evelyn Gallagher. She had flown first class across the country specifically for this dinner. She ordered an expensive bottle of red wine and raised her glass. "To the best investment I ever made," she said. We ate dry-aged ribeye and discussed market forecasts. She did not ask about my parents. She understood that chapter was permanently closed. Before the dessert arrived, she reached into her tailored blazer and produced a long velvet box. Inside was a heavy sterling silver pen, custom engraved with my initials. "You are officially playing in the major leagues now, Maya," she told me, her eyes locking onto mine with sharp intensity. "Do not let anyone negotiate your worth down. And never let them see your ledger until you hold all the leverage." I took her advice as gospel. Over the next 6 years, I executed a financial strategy characterized by strict discipline and total silence. My new position as a junior analyst provided a starting salary of $95,000, plus performance bonuses. A normal 22-year-old might have upgraded their lifestyle immediately. I did the exact opposite. I rented a modest studio apartment in a safe but unglamorous neighborhood. I drove a reliable 6-year-old Mazda sedan. I kept my social media profiles locked down, posting nothing but occasional pictures of landscapes or generic coffee cups. To my family, I was still the invisible, struggling daughter grinding away in a cubicle somewhere. They had no idea what was actually happening in the shadows. Every single month, I systematically routed my income into wealth-building vehicles. I maximized my employer-sponsored retirement accounts before the money even hit my checking account. I aggressively funneled my quarterly bonuses into low-cost index funds. I lived on less than 40% of my net income. By the time I turned 25, I was promoted to senior analyst, managing portfolios worth tens of millions of dollars. At 26, I purchased a beautiful brick townhome in a quiet historic district, putting down a massive cash payment to secure a microscopic interest rate. I furnished it slowly with high-quality pieces. I did not post photos of the granite countertops or the vaulted ceilings online. By my 28th birthday, I logged into my primary brokerage account to audit my progress. I had been aggressive, but I also had the wind at my back. A historic bull market had doubled my early stock investments, and the modest brick townhome I purchased at 26 had skyrocketed in value as the neighborhood gentrified. When I consolidated the numbers across my retirement and real estate equity, I stared at the bottom line. It had 7 digits. I was a self-made millionaire. I celebrated by making myself a cup of tea and sitting on my private balcony watching the sunset over the city skyline. Meanwhile, the financial reality in my parents' household was shifting from a slow bleed to a catastrophic hemorrhage. The corporate lawsuit against Chase had drained my father's savings entirely. But toxic devotion rarely yields to logic. Instead of cutting their losses, my parents chose to fund another illusion. Through the family grapevine, I learned the horrifying specifics of their latest maneuver. Chase had convinced them to back a brand new venture. This time, he was not disrupting the software industry. He was launching a luxury canine concierge service. It was essentially a high-end dog-walking franchise marketed to wealthy suburbanites. To fund this absurd fantasy, my parents went to the bank and authorized an $80,000 home equity line of credit against the house I grew up in. They mortgaged the roof over their heads so Chase could buy 3 custom-wrapped transit vans and lease a storefront in a gentrified neighborhood. The math of their bad decisions was compounding rapidly. The interest rates were variable. The overhead for the canine business was massive. Chase, predictably, hated waking up early and refused to actually walk any dogs himself, forcing the business to hire overpriced contractors from day one. I watched this slow-motion train wreck from a distance. The suburban facade they had maintained for decades was visibly cracking. The pristine landscaping at their house went unkempt. The exterior paint began to peel. The tension was building like tectonic plates grinding against one another, They were leveraging debt to pay off older debt, an inescapable downward spiral. I knew the inevitable collision was approaching. When the structural integrity of their finances finally collapsed, they would desperately search through the wreckage for anything of value. And I knew exactly who they were going to call. The collapse of a toxic financial ecosystem does not happen overnight. It is not a sudden cinematic explosion. It is a slow, agonizing suffocation. It is the sound of collection notices piling up in a mailbox and the steady hum of a credit card being declined at a grocery store checkout line. Chase saw his luxury canine concierge service fold exactly 14 months after its grand opening. The 3 custom-wrapped transit vans were quietly repossessed in the middle of the night. The gentrified storefront sat empty, the lease broken, accumulating daily penalties. My brother was now 32 years old. He possessed no degree, no viable work history, and a resume consisting entirely of fabricated executive titles from companies that no longer existed. The inevitable occurred. He moved back into his childhood bedroom. He brought with him a leased BMW he could not afford to insure, parking the shiny German machinery on the cracked concrete driveway of a house my parents were quietly desperate to save from foreclosure. The visual contrast was striking. The glossy sedan sat in front of peeling exterior paint and gutters overflowing with dead leaves. My brother was a walking monument to unearned arrogance, sleeping under a roof his parents were actively losing just to subsidize his ego. The $80,000 home equity line of credit my parents took out to fund the dog walking franchise had ballooned. Because they secured a variable interest rate, the monthly payments shifted from uncomfortable to impossible within a year. But that was only the surface level of the ruin. To keep up the payments and maintain their country club membership, my father committed the ultimate act of financial desperation. He began liquidating his retirement accounts. He drained his primary pension and cashed out his mutual funds early, incurring massive tax penalties just to make the minimum payments on Chase's assorted debts. They sacrificed their past, their present, and their entire future on the altar of the golden child. The ledger was buried so deep in the red that daylight could no longer reach it. For a family that valued public perception above all else, the slide into poverty was a fate worse than death. They spent decades projecting an image of upper-middle-class stability. Now they were drowning in a shallow pool of their own making, terrified that someone would notice the water rising. But in a tight-knit suburban community, secrets have a remarkably short shelf life. The whispers in our hometown grew louder with each passing week. Neighbors noticed the neglected landscaping. The lawn service stopped coming in May. By July, the grass was knee-high, and the flower beds were choked with weeds. Relatives began to gossip during Sunday dinners. My parents had systematically approached uncles, cousins, and old family friends, asking for short-term loans to cover unexpected medical bills or temporary cash flow hiccups. People started comparing notes. They realized Richard and Susan were not experiencing a temporary rough patch. They were sinking, and they were trying to drag anyone with a checkbook down with them. When you burn through every conventional credit line, exhaust the goodwill of your social circle, and face the reality of bank foreclosure, panic sets in. Desperation breeds a very specific kind of audacity. You stop looking for logical solutions and start looking for victims. Having tapped dry every sympathetic relative and exhausted their final credit card, my parents suddenly remembered their scapegoat. They remembered the quiet, obedient daughter who used to hand over her minimum wage earnings without a fight. In their minds, I was still frozen in amber. I was still 18 years old, easily intimidated, desperate for their approval, and presumably still scraping by in some cramped city apartment. They had spent 10 years ignoring my existence, but now they needed a lifeline. They decided I was going to provide it. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon. I was sitting at my mahogany desk in downtown Chicago, analyzing a municipal bond portfolio, when my phone vibrated. It was a text message from my father. It was the first direct communication I had received from him in over a year. The message contained no pleasantries. He did not ask how my career was progressing or if I was healthy. The phrasing was precise, cold, and entirely manipulative. "Maya," the text read, We are holding a critical family meeting this Sunday at 2 in the afternoon. Aunt Linda is hosting at her house. Your attendance is mandatory. We are discussing matters that affect the entire family structure. Do not be late. I stared at the glowing screen. The psychology of the message was fascinating. By choosing the word mandatory, he was attempting to reassert parental authority over a 28-year-old woman he did not know. By staging the meeting at Aunt Linda's house, he was setting a trap on neutral ground, ensuring there would be an audience to pressure me into compliance. They needed something substantial. You do not summon the estranged daughter to a family tribunal unless the stakes are existential. Before responding, I opened a new tab on my web browser. I accessed the County Property Records database. It is a matter of public record when a bank files a notice of default on a residential mortgage. I typed in the address of my childhood home. The search results loaded instantly. There it was. A formal notice of default filed 3 weeks prior by a national lending institution. My parents were 90 days past due on the primary mortgage, and the home equity line of credit was maxed out. They were legally standing on the edge of a cliff. I understood the play immediately. They could not qualify for a refinancing plan on their own. Their credit scores were destroyed. Chase was a financial ghost. They needed a clean slate. They needed a pristine credit history to co-sign a new loan, effectively transferring their toxic debt onto someone else's shoulders. They intended to hand me the anchor and push me overboard. I looked back at the text message. My father expected me to cower. He expected me to show up trembling, eager to prove my worth to the family by sacrificing my own stability. He thought he was summoning a scared teenager. I typed a 2-word reply. See you. I did not feel fear. I did not feel the familiar childhood anxiety tightening in my chest. I felt the calm, cold precision of an accountant reviewing a ledger that was about to balance perfectly. I opened my personal safe. I pulled out a leather portfolio and began gathering the documents that would permanently dismantle their illusion. The ambush was set for Sunday, but they had no idea who was actually walking into the trap. Sunday arrived with overcast skies and a damp chill in the air. I parked my reliable Mazda 2 blocks down from Aunt Linda's suburban cul-de-sac. I did not want them analyzing my vehicle. I walked the remaining distance carrying a slender leather portfolio tucked under my arm. I wore dog slacks and a simple navy cashmere sweater. It was the uniform of someone who had nothing left to prove. I stepped onto the porch and rang the doorbell. Aunt Linda opened the door almost instantly. Her face was set in an expression of tragic severity, as if she were greeting mourners at a wake. "Maya," she whispered, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. "We are all gathered in the den. Please, just listen to your parents today." I offered a curt nod and walked past her. The atmosphere in the living room was thick with manufactured solemnity. It felt like a poorly rehearsed stage play. My parents sat rigidly on the center sofa. They looked noticeably older. The past year of financial terror had carved deep lines around my father's mouth and thinned my mother's hair. They projected the aura of exhausted martyrs. In stark contrast, Chase slouched in an oversized leather armchair adjacent to the fireplace. He wore a designer hoodie that likely cost more than his monthly car insurance premium. He was scrolling rapidly on his phone, entirely detached from the ruin he had single-handedly engineered. He did not look up when I entered. Surrounding this core trio were 4 strategically selected relatives. Uncle David, Cousin Greg, and 2 aunts sat around the perimeter of the room. They were the audience. They were the muscle brought in to enforce compliance through collective guilt. "Sit down, Maya," my father instructed, gesturing to a straight-backed wooden chair positioned directly across from the sofa. It was a classic interrogation tactic, placing the subject lower and isolated from the group. I sat. I placed the leather portfolio flat on my lap. My father did not waste time inquiring about my health or my career. He steepled his fingers and launched into a monologue that he had clearly practiced in front of a mirror. "We are living in unprecedented economic times," he began, his voice adopting a somber, resonant pitch. The market is unforgiving. Good, hard-working people are finding themselves squeezed by circumstances entirely out of their control. He was framing their catastrophic financial mismanagement as an unavoidable act of God. It was a fascinating psychological defense mechanism. This family has always prided itself on sticking together through adversity, he continued, his gaze sweeping the room to collect nods of agreement from the assembled relatives. When one of us stumbles, the others form a wall. We protect our own. He finally made eye contact with me. And right now, Maya, we need that wall. Your mother and I are facing a temporary liquidity crisis. The bank is being unreasonable regarding the mortgage on the house you grew up in. I remained perfectly still. I did not nod. I did not offer a sympathetic smile. I simply maintained eye contact. My father reached into his briefcase and produced a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy legal-sized paper. He dropped the stack onto the glass coffee table with a dull thud. He slid the paperwork across the surface until it rested directly in front of my knees. We are restructuring our debt, he announced, tapping the top page. We have negotiated a refinancing agreement that will consolidate the home equity line and the primary mortgage. It will save the house. The problem is, our debt-to-income ratio is currently stretched too thin to qualify independently. He paused, letting the heavy silence fill the room. The trap was opening. We need a co-signer, he declared smoothly. We need someone with a completely clean credit history to append their name to the agreement. It is purely a formality. We will handle all the monthly payments. You will not pay a single dime. I looked down at the top page. The numbers were clearly visible. The refinancing agreement was for a staggering $300,000. They were not asking me for a modest loan. They were demanding I bind my financial identity to a massive toxic liability. If they missed a single payment, the bank would immediately pursue me for the entire balance. It was a kamikaze mission, and I was being ordered into the cockpit. Maya, please. My mother leaned forward, deploying her most potent weapon. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over her lower lashes with practiced precision. She reached out, her hand hovering in the air between us. Maya, please, she pleaded, her voice trembling. We know you have struggled. We know you have not made much of yourself in the city, working retail and living in that tiny apartment. We understand you don't have savings to contribute. But your credit score is a blank slate. The insult was woven seamlessly into the plea. Even in their darkest moment of desperation, they had to maintain the hierarchy. They had to ensure I knew I was inferior. It is the absolute least you can do, my mother sniffled, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. After everything we provided for you. We kept a roof over your head for 18 years. We clothed you. We fed you. We are asking you to do this one simple thing to save the family home. Uncle David cleared his throat loudly from the corner, adding his weight to the pressure cooker. It is the right thing to do, Maya, he grunted. Family comes first. Chase finally looked up from his glowing screen. He rolled his eyes, visibly annoyed that this process was taking so long. Just sign the damn papers, Maya, he snapped. Stop making this a big dramatic event. You owe Mom and Dad. They had surrounded me completely. They had constructed a narrative where refusing to sign a $300,000 death warrant made me a selfish, ungrateful villain. They fully expected me to crack. They expected the weight of the audience and the sheer audacity of the demand to break my resolve. They assumed I was still the timid teenager who accepted the community college brochure without a fight. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I did not rush to defend my career or explain my actual net worth. I simply rested my right hand on the zipper of my leather portfolio. I looked at my father, then at my mother, and finally at my brother. The silence in the room stretched until it felt brittle enough to snap. The air pressure dropped. The performance was over, and the ledger was about to be opened. Let me get this straight, I said. My voice was eerily calm. It cut through the heavy silence of the living room like a scalpel. The pitch did not waver. I did not shift in my wooden chair. I looked directly at the stack of papers resting on the glass coffee table, then looked up at my parents. You want me to append my name to a $300,000 refinancing agreement to bail out the house you mortgaged to fund a canine concierge service? Chase finally looked up from his phone. His jaw clenched. He dropped the device onto his lap, visibly offended that the spotlight had shifted to his failures. Do not be a brat, Maya, he scoffed. His tone was dismissive. It was the exact voice he used when we were children, and I refused to give him my allowance. Mom and Dad are losing the house. You owe them. They raised you. I turned my gaze toward my brother. I owe them for basic necessities they were legally obligated to provide, I asked softly. Or do I owe them for the $85,000 they drained from my trust account 10 years ago to fund your first failed tech company? The mention of the stolen trust fund caused a physical ripple across the room. My mother gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. My father stiffened. The relatives exchanged uncomfortable glances. Bringing up past financial crimes was considered a violation of family etiquette. You were supposed to absorb the theft and pretend it was a charitable donation. Aunt Linda uncrossed her legs and leaned forward, eager to defend the toxic hierarchy. You have always been so selfish, she chimed in. Her face flushed with righteous indignation. You hold on to things for a decade just to throw them in your parents' faces when they are vulnerable. Look at you. You live in a tiny apartment. You have no husband. You have no children. You have zero major responsibilities. The family needs this right now. Your brother needs a place to live. The logic was breathtaking. It was a perfect distillation of how society often views independent women. A woman without a husband or children is perceived as having excess capacity. Her time, her money, and her very identity are treated as communal property, available to be harvested by the designated patriarchs of the family. Because I was allegedly single and working retail, Aunt Linda believed my financial future was entirely expendable. I looked at Aunt Linda. I did not defend my marital status or explain my real estate holdings. If I co-sign this loan, I said, maintaining a steady and low volume, I become jointly and severally liable for the entire $300,000 debt. When Richard and Susan miss a payment, the bank does not care about family loyalty. They will garnish my wages, they will destroy my credit score. They will ensure I can never purchase a home or secure a decent interest rate for the next 7 years. You are asking me to detonate my own life so Chase can continue parking a leased luxury vehicle in a driveway he does not own. Cousin Greg shifted uncomfortably against the wall. The undeniable truth of the banking system was disrupting the emotional manipulation. I was translating their demands into stark mathematical reality, and they hated the translation. I looked closely at the paperwork resting near my knees. Reading upside down was a skill I had perfected during my early days as a junior analyst. The document was a 30-year adjustable rate mortgage. It was the worst possible financial instrument for a couple in their late 50s facing insolvency. The interest rate was predatory. The terms included balloon payments they could never realistically meet. They were not saving the house. They were simply delaying the foreclosure by 12 months while ensuring I would go down with the sinking ship. I pointed at the second paragraph on the first page. Did you even read the terms of this agreement? I asked my father. The introductory rate expires in 36 months. After that, your monthly obligation increases by 40%. You liquidated your pension to pay for a dog-walking franchise that folded in a year. How exactly do you plan to cover a 40% increase in housing costs when neither of you has a stable retirement fund left to draw from? My father flinched. The question hit him like a physical blow. He did not expect me to understand the terminology. He certainly did not expect me to dissect the flawed structure of his bailout plan in front of an audience. That is none of your concern, he snapped, his face reddening. We have a plan. We are consulting with advisors. Advisors, I repeated, allowing a small, cold smile to touch my lips. You mean Chase. You are taking financial advice from a man who currently owes thousands of dollars in commercial lease penalties and drives a vehicle he cannot afford to insure. Chase sat up straight, the smirk instantly vanishing from his face. Keep my name out of your mouth, he demanded, pointing a finger at me. You do not know anything about business. You fold sweaters for a living. Uncle David muttered something under his breath about respect. The tension in the room was boiling over. The carefully constructed narrative was unraveling because I refused to play the assigned role of the emotional victim. I was treating their tragedy like a hostile corporate takeover, stripping away the familial guilt and exposing the raw numbers underneath. My father realized he was losing control of the room. He needed to reassert dominance quickly. He leaned over the coffee table, picked up a heavy silver pen, and tapped it sharply against the signature line of the top document. Sign it, Maya, he ordered. His voice dropped an octave, attempting to project unquestionable authority. We do not have time for your typical dramatics. The bank needs these forms returned by tomorrow morning. Your mother is sick with worry. I am not going to sit here and debate history with a child who refuses to understand how the real world operates. I looked at the silver pen. It was a cheap imitation of a high-end brand, the plating already chipping near the grip. I thought about the custom-engraved sterling silver pen Evelyn Gallagher had handed me at the 5-star steakhouse 6 years ago. The contrast between my father's hollow demands and Mrs. Gallagher's genuine investment in my future was poetic. The micro-expressions in the room were fascinating to observe. My father gripped the pen so tightly, his knuckles turned white, revealing a deep, vibrating desperation beneath his bluster. My mother continued her performative weeping, peeking through her fingers to gauge my reaction, tears flowing strictly on command. Chase wore an arrogant stare, leaning back in his chair, fully expecting me to fold under the collective weight of the room. He had spent his entire life watching my parents break my boundaries, and he assumed today would be no different. They had orchestrated this ambush meticulously. They chose a Sunday afternoon, ensuring maximum attendance from the extended family. They placed me in the center of the room, isolating me physically. They utilized the combination of guilt, shame, and outright aggression to create a high-pressure environment where compliance felt like the only avenue of escape. They expected me to shrink. They expected me to apologize for my existence, to accept the label of the selfish daughter, and to quietly sacrifice my financial identity to pad their sinking ship. But an ambush only works if the target is unarmed. You are right about one thing, Dad, I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper. The room went dead silent. Everyone leaned in, anticipating the surrender. The real world operates on strict rules. It operates on verifiable data. It operates on risk assessment and return on investment. My mother let out a loud theatrical sob. You are tearing this family apart, Maya, she wailed. We are begging you for help, and you are treating us like strangers in a boardroom. She was right. I was treating them like strangers in a boardroom. Because the people who loved me would never ask me to sign a suicide pact disguised as a mortgage. I did not reach for the pen. Instead, I slowly unzipped the brass closure of my leather portfolio. The sound echoed in the quiet living room like a match striking a rough surface. I looked around the circle of expectant faces. They thought they had cornered a frightened retail worker with a blank credit history. They had vastly underestimated the math they were dealing with, and they had no idea they were about to audit a millionaire. I did not touch the silver pen. I let it rest on top of the predatory loan documents, a useless prop in a theater production that had just been canceled. Instead, I unzipped the brass closure of my leather portfolio. The metallic sound echoed in the quiet living room, drawing every eye in the room to my hands. I do not have typical dramatics, Dad, I said, my voice steady and cold. I have receipts. I reached inside the portfolio and extracted the first piece of paper. It was printed on thick, embossed parchment. I laid it flat on the glass coffee table, directly next to his refinancing agreement. My father frowned, leaning forward. His eyes scanned the document, struggling to contextualize what he was seeing. It was my university diploma. The seal was stamped in gold foil. The text clearly stated my name, my Bachelor of Science in Finance, and the words summa cum laude. "What is this?" my father muttered, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. "This is a fake. You went to community college. You took night classes." "I did not take night classes," I corrected him, my tone conversational. "I attended one of the top business schools in the country. I graduated in the top 1% of my cohort. I have been working as a financial analyst for the past 6 years." My mother stared at the diploma, the color rapidly draining from her face. Her performative tears stopped instantly, replaced by a hollow, uncomprehending shock. The narrative she had clung to for a decade was crumbling in real time. Before they could articulate a response, I pulled the second document from my portfolio. It was a printed copy of a county property deed. I placed it gently over the diploma. "This is the title to my primary residence," I explained, tapping the center of the page. "It is a 3-bedroom townhome in the historic district downtown. You will notice the watermark in the bottom right corner. It says satisfied in full. I do not have a mortgage. I do not have a landlord. I own the property outright." Uncle David shifted his weight in his chair, the leather creaking loudly in the silent room. The power dynamic was shifting violently. 10 minutes ago, I was the destitute daughter they could bully into submission. Now, I was dropping documented proof of substantial, verified assets onto the table. Chase leaned forward, his eyes darting across the property deed. The zip code listed at the top was one of the most affluent in the city. The arrogant smirk that usually lived on his face began to waver, replaced by a creeping, undeniable panic. He was looking at concrete evidence of the success he had spent his entire life pretending to possess. But I was not finished. I reached into the portfolio one last time and withdrew a single sheet of standard printer paper. It was a redacted bank statement from my primary investment brokerage. I had used a bright yellow highlighter to illuminate the bottom line on the final column. I laid it on top of the deed, directly in front of my father. "That is my liquid portfolio," I stated clearly. My father reached for the paper, his hand trembling so violently that the sheet rattled against the glass coffee table. He stared at the 7-figure balance as if it were a death warrant. The silence in the room changed instantly. It was no longer the heavy silence of their disappointment. It was the cold silence of absolute power shifting. My mother's hand went to her throat, her fingers fumbling with a fake pearl necklace as she realized the daughter she had dismissed as a failure could now buy and sell their family home 10 times over. His jaw slackened. He blinked repeatedly, as if the numbers were an optical illusion that might vanish if he focused hard enough. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound emerged. The psychological impact of realizing his scapegoat was vastly wealthier than his entire combined bloodline rendered him entirely mute. Aunt Linda, unable to contain her curiosity, leaned far over the armrest of her chair to look at the paper. When she saw the highlighted figure, she let out an audible, sharp gasp. Her hand flew to her mouth. In that single breath, the gossip network of our hometown was irrevocably altered. She knew the truth, and she knew the depths of my parents' lies. "You did not empty my college fund to give Chase potential," I said, looking directly into my father's panicked eyes. My voice carried no anger, only the chilling finality of an audit. "You emptied it because you are financially illiterate. You stole $85,000 from an 18-year-old girl because you lacked the discipline to manage your own household budget." My mother tried to interject, her voice shaking. "Maya, we thought it was best for the family. We did not know." "You did not know anything," I interrupted, shutting her down instantly. "You handed a $20,000 check to a son who burns money for sport, and you handed me a brochure. But you made a fatal miscalculation. Evelyn Gallagher saw exactly what you were doing. She secured me a $240,000 private scholarship the very next day." The mention of Mrs. Gallagher,
the wealthy real estate investor my parents had always dismissed as my quirky retail manager, landed like a physical blow. They realized the magnitude of the secret I had carried. They realized I had been laughing at their subtle demands and their group chat boasts for 10 years. I have spent the last decade building wealth in total silence, I continued, my gaze sweeping across the room, taking in the stunned faces of my relatives. I maximized my retirement accounts. I invested in index funds. I purchased real estate. I built an empire while you bankrupted yourselves for a golden child who still needs you to buy his groceries and co-sign his car insurance. Chase sank back into his armchair. The smirk was entirely gone. He looked small, fragile, and utterly exposed. Stripped of my parents' financial shield, he was nothing more than an unemployed 32-year-old man living in a childhood bedroom facing imminent foreclosure. The audience of relatives, brought in to pressure me, were now staring at him with undisguised pity and disgust. The trap had shattered. They had built a cage out of guilt and shame, expecting to lock me inside it. But you cannot cage someone who holds the deed to the property. I looked at the silver pen resting on the table. Then I looked at the $300,000 refinancing agreement. The silence in the room was deafening. It was the sound of a toxic system finally collapsing under the weight of its own mathematical reality. They had played their final card and they had lost everything. Now, there was only one thing left for me to do. I am not signing your documents, I stated. I stood up from the rigid wooden chair and reached for my dark coat draped over the armrest. I slid my arms into the sleeves and fastened the buttons with deliberate, unhurried precision. The entire room watched my hands. Nobody spoke. The collective shock had paralyzed their vocal cords. The narrative they relied upon to govern our family dynamic had just been dismantled by basic mathematics, and they had no alternate script to read from. I looked down at the coffee table, at the predatory refinancing forms resting beneath the weight of my university diploma and my property deed. I am not your bank, I continued, my voice maintaining the steady cadence of a boardroom presentation. And I am no longer your scapegoat. You gambled your retirement, your home, and your future on Chase. You made your investment choices based on favoritism rather than competence. Now, you can live with the return on your investment. I reached down, collected my 3 pieces of paper, and slid them safely back into my leather portfolio. I pulled the brass zipper shut. The metallic sound was the final punctuation mark on a 10-year sentence. I turned my back on them and walked out of the living room. The distance from Aunt Linda's den to her front door was perhaps 30 feet, but the journey felt monumental. I half expected my father to shout, to order me back into the chair, or for my mother to launch into a fresh wave of performative weeping. I anticipated the heavy footsteps of Cousin Greg or Uncle David moving to block the exit. But there was nothing. No one followed me. There was only the devastating, hollow silence of a reality they could no longer manipulate. They were staring at a brick wall they could not guilt-trip, bully, or lie their way through. I grasped the brass handle of the front door, turned it, and stepped out onto the porch. The lock clicked shut behind me. Walking down the concrete sidewalk toward my reliable Mazda, the crisp afternoon air filled my lungs. My chest felt incredibly light. The invisible weight of unearned familial debt, a burden I had carried since childhood, evaporated into the overcast sky. I slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and merged onto the highway heading back to the city. I expected my phone to vibrate endlessly that evening. I anticipated a barrage of furious text messages or voicemails accusing me of arrogance and betrayal. But my phone remained dark. The radio silence was profound. By displaying my ledger, I had stripped them of their favorite weapon. They could no longer claim I was a jealous failure. They could no longer paint themselves as benevolent providers. The undeniable proof of my independence terrified them, and they retreated into their sinking ship to await the inevitable.
The demise of their suburban kingdom unfolded precisely according to standard banking regulations. There were no dramatic courtroom battles or last-minute reprieves. When a lending institution realizes the borrower possesses zero assets and maxed-out credit lines, the bureaucratic machinery grinds forward without mercy. I monitored the county public records from my office desk over the next several months. 3 weeks after our final meeting, the bank formally rejected their request for a loan modification. The grace period expired. The default transitioned into active foreclosure proceedings. In a neighborhood that thrived on manicured appearances and pristine homeowner association records, the collapse was a public spectacle. Neighbors watched from their kitchen windows as process servers arrived at the front porch to deliver legal notices. The landscaping died entirely. The paint continued to peel. The structure that had housed so much manufactured superiority was now a blighted property on a pristine street. 90 days after I walked out of Aunt Linda's house, the county sheriff arrived to oversee the eviction. Richard and Susan were forced to pack 30 years of accumulated status into cardboard boxes. Because their credit scores were effectively destroyed by the foreclosure and the defaulted business loans, they could not secure a lease in their own town. No reputable property management company would accept their application. They were forced to relocate 3 towns over, settling for a cramped 2-bedroom unit in a sprawling anonymous apartment complex bordering a noisy interstate highway. The spatial downgrade was severe. They traded vaulted ceilings and a formal dining room for the thin walls of a complex where you can hear the neighbors arguing through the vents. The most cutting blow was not the lack of space, but the public death of their pride. My mother, who once looked down on anyone who did not drive a luxury SUV, now had to carry her laundry in a plastic basket to a shared facility, avoiding eye contact with strangers. They no longer had a golden child to brag about. They only had a son in a green vest and a daughter who had become a ghost they could no longer afford to haunt. They could no longer host holiday dinners or brag to the extended family about their investments. The country club membership lapsed. The facade was permanently erased. But the most profound shift occurred within the golden child himself. Stripped of my parents' financial shield, Chase hit the concrete floor of reality. His leased luxury sedan was repossessed in the middle of the night from the apartment complex parking lot. Without a vehicle, without seed capital, and possessing a resume filled entirely with fraudulent executive titles, he had to enter the actual labor market. He applied for corporate management positions and was promptly rejected by every single firm. Desperation eventually forced his hand. At 32 years old, the visionary entrepreneur was hired at a local chain hardware store. He had to take the municipal bus to work. He wore a green vest over a polo shirt. He spent his days cutting duplicate keys, stocking bags of mulch, and sweeping the aisles under the harsh fluorescent lights. He had to report to a shift manager who was 10 years younger than him. His entire salary went toward paying his mandated commercial lease penalties and his basic grocery bills. The universe has a remarkable way of balancing the scales when the enablers run out of funds. I watched none of this happen in person. I did not drive past their apartment complex to gloat. I did not call Aunt Linda to mine for gossip. I simply let the natural consequences of their actions wash over them. On a bright Tuesday morning, I sat on the private balcony of my paid-off townhome. I held a ceramic mug of dark roast coffee, watching the city skyline reflect the early sunlight. My investment portfolio was generating passive income while I slept. My career was accelerating. My mind was quiet. I felt the profound, enduring peace of a closed door. Society often conditions us to believe that cutting ties with toxic relatives is a cruel act. We are told that family is an unbreakable bond, requiring endless forgiveness and infinite financial bailouts. But I learned a different truth in Mrs. Gallagher's study all those years ago. Boundaries are not punishments, they are armor. If your family looks at you and sees a piggy bank instead of a person, you owe them nothing. If they demand you sacrifice your future to subsidize their delusions, you have the right to secure your ledger and walk away. You do not have to scream. You do not have to argue. Take your currency, take your dignity, and quietly build your fortress. What about you? Have you ever realized your family viewed your success as communal property? Have you ever let the golden child bankrupt the family ecosystem while you quietly built an empire in the shadows? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. Thank you for joining me here at Sweet Karma Life, and remember, the best revenge is always a life well lived. I often sit on my balcony as the city lights wake up, holding a ceramic mug of dark roast coffee, thinking about that manila envelope and the glossy community college brochure. I do not feel anger anymore. Anger requires an ongoing emotional investment, and my capital is entirely tied up in my own peace. Watching the morning traffic navigate the streets below, I reflect on the wreckage of my parents' finances and the quiet stability of the life I constructed. The journey from a discarded teenage scapegoat to a self-made financial analyst taught me survival tactics you cannot learn in a corporate boardroom. Looking back, I realized my parents did not just invest in the wrong child, they invested in the wrong values. They chose appearance over substance and ego over equity. Today, Chase spends his afternoons stocking shelves at a hardware store, breathing in the scent of sawdust and defeat. My parents are learning to live within the thin walls of a rented apartment where the sound of the interstate highway never stops. They wanted a wall of family loyalty, but all they built was a monument to their own failure. The best revenge is not shouting from the rooftops. It is building a fortress in total silence and then owning the land it stands on. Thank you for joining me at Sweet Karma Life. Remember, your worth is never determined by people who are committed to misunderstanding you. Like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next story.